everyone. I am going to do a bit of a walkthrough with critiques of some various practices that are in the schools right now when it comes to behaviors and social emotional learning. I'm going to talk about CASEL, I'm going to talk about Ruler, and I'm going to bring in restorative justice and PBIS as well. But I'm going to focus specifically on these two. And the idea here is to look and see like what is it that they're doing and what are their limitations, and then look for sort of a counter. Uh, how can we do this in a different way? So let me get right to it. So first thing I do when what I ask people to do is step out of the land of behaviors and emotions for a second and take a look at this art piece. And if you're a student of mine, you've had me before, you've seen this art piece, right? And what I oftentimes do is say, okay, take some time to just look at this. What do you see? So I'll just give you a few seconds to do a quick scan. So I'll give you some background here. Jessica Pearlstein is an artist who made this, and it was for artwork for a book, but I really like just pulling it out as a standalone piece. The piece here is about imagining or reimagining San Francisco. You see the Transamerican Pyramid back there. You see the Easter egg, City Hall, right? So this is about reimagining and retrofitting San Francisco, an urban environment, major urban environment, to be much more in balance. And so you see many aspects of that, right? You see the alternative energies, the solar panels, the wind turbines. You see the mass transportation way in the background, sort of symbolized there with the kind of up in the air tram system. Um, and you see some significant changes with the mix of building and plants. There's a lot of nature in this space, right? It's an urbanized space. You see how the main street there, is not really a regular street anymore, that there's a permacultural garden there, which is great for folks locally planting and harvesting their own food. You see the intersection there is a gathering place for people to get together for lots of various purposes, right? And you see on top of the buildings, you see the geodesic domes, you see the rooftop gardens. And of course, in the foreground, you see somebody who is just sort of having this moment, right, with this beautiful blooming flower. She's a woman of color, presumably, and of course, from the artist's perspective, that's deliberate, right? And of course, you see the Buddhist prayer flags going across from building to building, also symbolizing some diversity there. So there's a lot of things that are sort of interwoven with each other, right? The nature, the hummingbirds, the urban environment, but this is a very, at least one depiction, right, of sustainability, of social diversity, somebody who at the moment is having a pretty positive well-being. And that's important to understand because this is the starting place for me whenever I think about what emotions mean to humans in general, and certainly in the context of schooling. So I want you to stay with this image. This image is going to keep coming up for us, right? So this is the starting place. Now, if you look at the framework of SEL, Social Emotional Learning, CASEL, framework. This is one that has made its way around the globe 50,000 times. It's very popular. It has a very self-oriented view, and it does stay with some life stages, right? So if you're a young kid in elementary school, you do think about yourself. You have self-oriented thinking. That's perfectly natural and normal for that age group. That life stage is very much about trying to imagine, reimagine yourself in that space, try to understand and negotiate, and um, there's a lot of trying to figuring out, right, based around oneself. That's appropriate for sort of an early elementary life stage, and having a bit more social awareness, um, and working on relationship skills, and making sure that there's some responsible thinking, responsible mindset around decision making. Now, sort of on its face, these are very positive things, and it is no wonder why people in school districts across the world are using this as a base to do some of their SEL work with kids. What is it missing? Where are its limitations? I'm not going to answer that at this particular moment, but think about that. Keep that in mind as we go along. Some folks have taken SEL, the CASEL framework, and connected it to culturally responsive teaching. And you can see some of the connections being made there. That's a good thing, right? But what it implies is that when CASEL framework was made, there wasn't culturally responsive thinking present. So right there is a bit of a limitation. More on that later. Ruler is a framework that Mark Brackett, you see Mark Brackett here, designed around the concept of emotional intelligence. Something that is really helpful for kids, just like CASEL with their SEL, to develop a deeper understanding of what emotions they're having so they can identify them and recognize them. They can try to figure out what to do about them, try to figure out how to cope with them, what decisions to make. This is all very much in the same area as is CASEL. Okay, so you can, I'll provide the link to the slideshow and you can take a look at the video that's embedded here. So RULER is an acronym. You can see what it stands for. Okay. Again, just another framework, another way of sort of putting things together to work with kids who are experiencing various emotional things, right? He talks about this in the video, sort of the way in which we can figure things out, make some decisions, deal with the moments as they are occurring, right? So in RULER, there's this sort of 4-quadrant spacing of emotions, and you can see it in more detail here. And so this is used oftentimes to help kids sort of pinpoint where their feelings are, right? And the more we can sort of zoom in, the more information we have, the more awareness we have, and the more we can try to figure out what's going on and what to do about it. Okay. The meta moment, you sort of see him talking about this, but this is about like what do we do in the moments where we have these emotional reactions, and I'm going to talk about this in a third version. But the idea is that something happens, you have this sort of sense within your body of anger, frustration, sadness, whatever, right? And what we're supposed to do, according to RULER, is stop, take a moment, envision your best self. What would my best self do with this? And whatever that best self would do, there's your strategy. And you can use that strategy to succeed. Okay? Now, I haven't really gone through where limitations are to a real extent just yet, right? But here's the issue. This child here is a child in a schooling system that has not positioned her as a valued person. She's a person, like all of our students, who's positioned as a pre-employee. They're not characterized as people of value who are going to make big, important contributions. They're They're seen as somebody who's going to get a job down the road. And if they move from a status of poverty or a status of working class, lower working class, to a higher status, upper middle class, especially, oh boy, there's some social justice right there for you, isn't it? Isn't that great? Isn't that awesome? So this is where we are stuck right now. To what extent do schools help or harm? To what extent are schools trauma informed? This is the language that we're using these days, right? Versus traumatizing. And you can see the ways in which schools are attempting right now on the left to do that kind of trauma informed work, and even that to me is a little cringeworthy. I think it's unfortunately I think it's too much of a way to limit the way we talk about kids. But certainly schools have this way of dehumanizing students. And it's not the intention of teachers, it's not the intention of administrators. What exactly is going on if it's not our intention, right? So let's start here, right? I said this is the starting point for understanding emotions. So what is missing from Ruler and Castle? Also missing from PBIS in a major way. And I would say restorative justice has elements of this, elements of some of these limitations, and I'll get to that in a second. So, but I used Ruler and Castle here as examples to have this discussion really about how helpful is it to teach kids and support kids emotionally with those kind of frameworks. So, what is missing in this picture? What is missing from the view of Ruler and from the view of Castle? Well, here's what it looks like from just their perspectives. So, what am I saying? What I'm saying is that their view of well-being is at the individual level, and that it doesn't really deal with the external as much as it needs to. And as I go through this, I think you'll understand more and more of why that's important. But there's a real problem here because we see them so separately. We see our internal stability as separate from the external stability, even though they both affect each other. So, on the positive side, if our internal environment is stable and supported, and the external environment is stable and supported, that's when we start to reach this state of thriving. So our internal and the external are reflections of each other. What we have going inside of us is oftentimes a reflection of what's going on outside of us. If we're not going to pay attention to that, as Castle, PBIS, and Ruler just simply omit and don't attend to, then that's all we're ever going to do is we're going to be caught in this constant internal whirlpool that is never really being affected by the external forces that are creating the whirlpool. And vice versa, that whirlpool is going to have an effect in the larger environment too. So that is a crucial move in the frame of reference for this contextual thinking about what we mean by emotions. Okay? This is crucial. Our social and environmental world is struggling immensely. There is quite a bit of instability and unsustainability with both. How can we assume that we can just simply have a higher level of well-being than what's going on separate from us, outside of us, if that's our view, right? And we know that is simply not true. When we lived in a stressed environment, we are stressed internally. Okay? And if it's chronic, then If it's chronic stress outside, it's a chronic stress inside too. So that's a shift in the frame of thinking right there. Okay, um, neither CASEL or Ruler or even PBIS, none of them deal with any of this level of thinking. They deal with sort of in the moment emotions and how we're going to handle them. CASEL takes a little bit more of a long term approach, right, than just Ruler's sort of emotional intelligence in the moment kind of stuff. CASEL takes it to a bit of another level, trying to develop more sort of ongoing awareness. That's a good thing, but it's limited because it doesn't go here, right? So what do I mean by here? Let's keep doing some work with this. So right now, we have a situation where well-being is basically, is the kid feeling like they are in a good place with this status of pre-employee being inflicted, right? Imposed and inflicted on them. And are they okay with chasing the dollar as a form of social justice? As if somehow or other chasing the dollar is not the root of social injustices. So many kids in our society are experiencing social injustice because of our chasing of the dollar, because of our ideology of greed. Right? We box each other out because that money is for me. So this ideology of greed, this heightened sense of individualism, this sense of my internal stability is separate from the externals, all of these things plague us. So we do need to really attend to this in very thoughtful ways that we're just simply not doing right now. So why does this framing of students tend to alienate them and make them not want to go to school? Are we asking ourselves that question? Are we seriously having that conversation with one another? Because it feels like a soul draining experience for many kids to go to public school right now. They like being with their friends. They might even like some of their teachers. Maybe they like some of their teachers a lot. They might even like some of the things that they're learning. But that's where it stops. It basically, if they see themselves as somebody who's possibly going to win the race, they feel good about themselves. But if not, they've given up on it. And we go, oh, how could they possibly act this way? Well, of course they're going to act this way. Anybody act this way. But the reality is, all we're doing is pushing them towards the almighty dollar. And we're telling them that if you just go to school and do your homework and do everything that's being asked of you, you're going to make more money. Right? Or if they're an affluent family, they're going to maintain their affluence, which is what affluent families really care about, which is why upper middle class and affluent families are so sort of ardent in pressing on schools the way that they do, because they have that fear, right, of their kid slipping out of that social status, that socioeconomic level. So that's what we're dealing with right now, whether it's at the upper levels of socioeconomics, at the levels of poverty, right? All kids are being pushed down this portal of greed. It's moralized, it's normalized, it's weird if we don't pursue it. Like, what's wrong with you if you don't pursue money, right? That's not going to be a real world money-making job. What's wrong with you? There's so many ways in which we use words to keep people on that path without saying it, right? We don't use the word greed like it's a good thing. When we do use the word greed, it's usually a bad thing. But we say it in so many other ways in a positive way. So our kids are feeling that in the pit of their soul, right? I mean, I feel that in the pit of my soul. And when teachers especially get on them about that connection between their work and, success, in this society, which means chasing the dollar, I think they feel it even worse, right? Because it's certainly not an altruistic endeavor. And it is something that's contributing to people suffering in our society. So how can that be seen as social justice or equity? Especially when it becomes the root of social injustices and social inequities. Here's just some more things if you want to listen to other people sort of talk about it in their own ways, okay? Now, we have to come to terms with the fact that we have legalized exploitation in our society. Slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, mass incarceration, all of these have been at some point legal ways of manipulating people into subservient and oppressed positions so that somebody else can get wealthy off of them. Right? We in slavery times made them the free labor force to make white people wealthy. In Jim Crow times, we were boxing them out so that they couldn't have access to the things that create wealth. Redlining was the same exact thing. It was just another form of segregation to keep people from home ownership, which is a main path towards personal wealth. And mass incarceration is literally putting them in prison so they can't have access to literally anything. All of which are legal, or at least have been during their times. Poverty is not an accident, like slavery and apartheid. It is man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings. Nelson Mandela's words should strike a chord, like the beginning of Beethoven's Third. Bump, bump. It should just hit you. And it is deeply tied to our emotions, especially if you're on the receiving end of this. So there's a lot of sort of chronic stress that's been infused into our society legally, historically, and contemporaneously to keep people from gaining. It's deliberate. So people have been boxed out, and society has sort of softened the corners, but it's still about boxing people out. But we use the word inclusion all the time. So we're not about changing the structure there of ideology of greed. We're not about changing that, right? We still want to be able to chase the dollar. We still want to rationalize it. We want to moralize it. We want to normalize it. And so that's where our well-being really begins. If that's our context for living, how good can our well-being ever be? So we're struggling right now with our students who, because they're being dehumanized into a status of pre-employee. They're not really students, they're just pre-employees. And all that means is that they're being conditioned to chase the almighty dollar like it's social justice. It is a form of social justice somehow. And so it should be of no surprise when you read something like the U.S. Department of Education's mission statement, which has been around for multiple presidential administrations, which is to say that it's agreed upon across the various political platforms. It should be of no surprise that global competitiveness, which is a proxy for greed, is the primary target for education. So to what extent do schools mirror stresses of the upper middle class employees? So if you take the left column and the right column, and if you go across testing anxiety disorder, what you see is that school mirrors a lot of what the adult struggles really are, right? Worries, concerns, things of that nature. And so you see aspects of that in the school environment as you do in the adult world of business especially. So How is this social justice? Please, somebody answer that to me. And I think anybody would say, well, it's better than living in poverty. Yeah, of course, right? You know, getting shot in the leg is getting better than shot in the heart. But it's not that much good, right? Sure. Yes, somebody can have more money and more access to things in our society. Whole other discussion for another day. Why we have to have money for access to live is a whole other discussion. But putting that aside, this is what people have to deal with. So they have to play. They literally have to play into the very system that creates their own suffering. That's not social justice. So right now, what we have is these sort of partial views of social emotional learning in schools, right? Which means that they're implicitly biased, which means that they're aimed at this sort of preferential view of people becoming these successful employees, right? Which is why SEL is biased towards what I call proud docilitarianism, right? We are encouraging students to be docile and proud of their docility, especially when the docility is rewarded by some sort of upper middle class employment. Again, like that's social justice. Not okay. There's a reason why we are not thriving as a society. There's a reason why some people make, gobs and gobs and gobs of money, and the rest of us don't. And the rest of us are struggling, and the rest of us never get out of debt. Even if we have jobs, and even if we have upper level degrees and things like that, that we're still struggling immensely. So this idea that we should become proud docilitarians is kind of at the core of what we participate in that gives us a poor sense of well-being. Right? We are self-regulated into a greed-oriented pre-employee status, and we measure success against American affluent consumerism. And of course, this creates lots of problems like depression, lack of purpose, and exploitation mindsets. Right? Self cannot fully thrive in a place that is socially and environmentally exploited. Community health affects self-health and vice versa. Contributing to exploitation denies us well-being. Public schooling is designed to make students contribute to exploitation in the form of things like consumerism, wealth concentration, and exploiting people from around the world. Public schooling is not designed to contribute towards thriving. Not yet. I believe that it absolutely could be, and that is the next paradigmatic shift for schools, is to really put that forward, really think that through, formalize it. Hey, let's even have some standards. We can do that. And actually, we do have some standards, right? There's sustainability standards out there, for instance. So these CASEL and rulers and PBISs, and to some extent, with restorative justice, but for the first three especially, have these very partial views of social and emotional connections to learning. And if we're going to make kids emotionally regulate in a context of exploitation, that's deeply, deeply unethical, immoral, in my view. And it's problematic to the level that is almost undescribable, right? But we normalize it. We have taken something that's hurting all of us, hurting the planet. We've normalized it like it's a good thing. We really hesitate to question its worth, its practices, its outcomes, and then we want to normalize people into it. So what we have here is that emotional equity, which is not present in the frameworks I've been talking about, emotional equity with an eye on the external stability is a more meaningful, complete way to support both well-being, internal, and moving towards sustainability. In other words, emotional equity is a big chunk of what's needed to really understand how to support people, and we get that sense of equity when we look at the external. So let's do some of that, right? So here we go. 8 steps. I'm calling this integrative emotional equity. IEE. We love acronyms. We love abbreviations. So here's the IEE framework. I'm laughing because, oh my God, we got to get away from all that, right? All right, step 1. Recognize history, implicit bias, and current conditions of exploitation. So we really truly do have to recognize the things that we've been talking about here, right? All of these things have been legalized. All of these things have been normalized. It was A-okay to enslave people so that white people can get rich. What's the problem? Right? So that's that. All of that. Just because it was legal doesn't mean it was ever right. That's just because something on the books is something that people of power agree to because they want it that way. It doesn't mean that's right. We have to ask that question of ourselves of what's going on contemporaneously with that too. In terms of black people in our society incarcerates them to extreme rates. And there's, of course, a lot of discussion around that. You can look at, just lots of books that are talking about that right now. So we have to be honest with ourselves about what's going on. We are creating a living experience that's a living hell for many, many, many people. And there is no way to have good, positive well-being when that's the situation. Step 2. We have to envision what a thriving community even is and what our responsibilities to it would be. How do we move from things like slavery through mass incarceration to this picture that we've I've been referring to of San Francisco? How do we get there? We have to envision the community that we want, and that's what's so powerful to me, at least. That's what's so compelling about this art piece, is that somebody has done that, right? Jessica Pearlstein has taken cues from many different places of thinking and put them all together, where you can actually see, granted, it's an art piece, right? But you can see well-being, sustainability, and thriving. That it's not something, that they're not things that are separate from one another. They're interwoven with one another. So we can do that, right? What is the next paradigm? And what are the mindsets that we need for us to get there? Our emotions are very much tied up with those things. Step 3. Social injustices are sources of chronic and relentless stress. We need to understand that many of our kids are feeling the ripple effects of so many things that our society has done wrong. The U.S. experiment has been punishing to people of color for centuries now. Indigenous folks at the start, and continuing even today, of course, and the way in which we have just punished people of color for even being here. So when you have a situation where a society deliberately does those things, you are going to stress people the F out. It's not their fault that they're chronically stressed, is it? So why do we have this view when they come into the school that somehow or other they just need to get it together? That they're not doing a good job of taking care of their emotions. Let's pause for a second and really look at that, because when somebody is living in a situation of chronic stress, everything is going to set them off. If you've experienced a period of chronic stress in your life, you know that you really can't take much else. When the new challenge comes around, it's like, I really cannot deal with this right now. And that's the best reaction to it. Most of us get really upset, mad, say things that we probably regret, do things that we probably regret, that we look back on for the rest of our lifetime and regret because we were chronically stressed in that moment. So why are we having a different expectation and a different set of standards for kids who are coming to our schools with all of that going on? And we're not dealing with it at all. We're just having a negative view of them, having a deficit view of them. So when we shift into this understanding of what happens with chronic stresses, we can become emotional stabilizers, right? So to that end, transition from bad stress to good stress. So what does that mean? Bad stress is the kind of stress where it just goes on and on and on and on and on. There's not a recovery period, and there's not even a sense of accomplishing anything. It just goes on. And so anything that's new, as I said before, sets a person off. And that becomes the normal reaction to things. So as teachers and as administrators, we need to have much better handle on the good stresses versus the bad stresses. Learning is primarily learning. I'm not talking about schooling, but just learning is a challenge. When we learn something new, we have to take the time to process it, think about it, make sense of it, and see if we actually understand it. That's a source of stress on some level, but it's a good stress, right? It stresses us in a way that helps us grow. That's great. So, cool to that. But even the learning good stuff, when it's tacked onto or piled onto the bad stresses, it's just now another bad stress. It's not a good stress. Right? It's just something else that we have to worry about. And so it's not a positive experience. So how, and this is hard to answer, but how can we have well-being in the classroom, positive well-being in the classroom, if there's a constant source of chronic bad stress that our kids are dealing with, and their families too? And again, go into yourself. When have you had a longer period? Maybe you're in it right now. I hope you're not. But how well do you handle things? Right? Maybe you do handle things well, and good for you if you do. But it's a lot harder to handle things well if you still handle them well. Right? A lot of us don't. We lose our minds. So, and we're talking about kids here, not fully developed adults who have a better sense of what they can do and all that. These are kids. So it's much easier for them, much quicker for them to get into that space of instability. So we need to humanize our kids. And what I mean by that is before there's this extreme emotion, right? So you saw Ruler deal with that in the meta moment graphic. So before that, I'm going to talk about things before something happens, right? Let me use the analogy here of, if you've ever owned a home, when do you clean the gutters? Well, you don't do it during the rainstorm, right? You clean the gutters when the weather is typically good. In other words, when are we going to deal with how to better deal with our emotions? Let's do that when we're not in a space or a place of emotional stress. It's probably better to just have a conversation about how we can do things better when we're not in the heat of the moment. And the other thing too is humanizing. Saying like, listen, I get it. I understand. I've been there. I hear you. Absolutely. I would feel sad. I have felt sad. I would feel mad. I have felt mad doing those things or having that experience or having something like that happen to me. And guess what that does? It builds so much trust, right? Our students, kids, look at us and go, oh, okay, this is a person I can talk to, which decreases the stress when they feel like there's trust there. So humanize, right? Be aware of students who are hitting the emotional wall before an extreme behavior arrives. I'll get into that in a bit. Give students breaks, talk to them. But these are things that we can do to just sort of alleviate the building stress that's happening. But we can also address, like, how do we cope with these things when the rainstorm's not there? Return to emotional calm. So the way in which we're seeing this sort of framed out with Castle and Ruler is that it's really important to get to a space of calm, right? We're dysregulated if we're not calm. Well, that's just complete crap, right? We're if we're gonna say if we're going to say that feeling mad and sad is like some level of dysregulation, then being human is dysregulated, right? So we cannot frame things in that way. And if people do, they need not to. Now, I know that's not exactly what dysregulation means, right? It tends to mean that, people sort of go between extreme things often, right, without some sort of regularity there. I sort of get that, but the way it's been conflated and sort of misunderstood is that it's like just because you're mad or sad about something means you're dysregulated. No, that's not true. Welcome to real life. Welcome to being human, right? Like we get mad, we get sad about something, and those emotions are really valuable. They tell us about something in our life that we just simply it's important enough for us to look at that and be like, no, that can't be, or that has to change, or whatever the situation is. Without those emotions, how do we know to change those things? So, it is important for us to feel validated. But let me get into this too. If you look at the reddish box there, it says, ask if you're adding stress into the classroom that is adding to bad stress, even if you think that it is good stress. That's something I said before. But check this out. Are your students calm, alert, or alarmed? That's really helpful for teachers to use as a frame of thinking. Just those three things alone. Calm, alert, alarmed. We do learn best when we're emotionally calm. We do learn probably nothing when we're emotionally alarmed. And being alert means we're going to be pretty distracted. But beyond just that alone, understanding when somebody is alert, meaning that they're feeling some emotions, but they're not really exhibiting them very much, maybe little bits here and there, but they're just sort of like on alert, right? So-and-so just came into the room, they don't like me, now they're just like their antennas up. There was a fight this morning. I'm still amped up from that. There was an argument. I got bad news about a friend or a family member. Just things like I'm not having a huge emotional reaction to it right now. Maybe I did that earlier in the day. Maybe I still haven't had it, but I'm just thinking about it. But that's where knowing your students is just so important, of course. And so this is what I call emotional equity. You give them what they need. You don't give them what everybody else gets. You give them what they need. And so we need to be able to do that, right? We need to be able to recognize when the student's in that alert stage, because it can go either way. They can bump right up to the alarm stage with some other sort of stress that comes in their life that may not be related to the thing that they're actually stressed about. Or with support, they can find a sense of resolution a bit more and get through the day a bit easier. Doesn't mean the problem goes away, right? Or that they're still not thinking about it, but they're less amped up about it. It's when they're in those stages or steps, when they're feeling alert. It's when they're there that we can do a lot of things to show them support and build that trust. That's so important. Okay. Also, we all make mistakes, and of course they're kids, right? They're not adults who just know what the right thing is to do all the time. They're still figuring things out. And really, we're still figuring things out too, right? But we become an emotionally stabilizing presence in their lives, right? We can help analyze things a bit with them, and we can also help stabilize just by saying, I understand, I got you, we got this, it's going to be okay, right? And that even making mistakes is just a part of the process, right? Step 6, humanizing, and that's what I was just talking about, right? Um, as I said before, imagine that you're going through chronic stress. You're not going to be your best person. You're going to have reactions much more quickly than you would normally. But imagine that's all you've ever really felt was chronic stress. That's a lot of our kids. That is a lot of our kids. And why? Because the external environment is terrible. Our society has a long history of treating the environment and treating people in very exploitative ways. We need to do a much, much better job of understanding that as teachers so that it's when the problems do arise, we understand much more where they're coming from. So after an extreme emotion, after somebody blows up, after somebody loses it, what can we do? And that's where that meta moment stuff from Ruler comes in, right? It's becoming like I can pause and have a second and try to figure out what my best self would do and all that. Okay, well, maybe, right? And it certainly has positive effects. I'm not downplaying for the many, many people that it has positively helped. So that's good. But sometimes it's not that easy, right? And again, where Ruler misses is not seeing the longer histories and contemporaneous issues that are going on externally that this person has no control over, but it's deeply affecting them on the conscious and subconscious levels. So that's crucial, right? And it's important to address the source of the emotion that somebody is feeling. What's the concern? What's the fear? What is it that's driving that urge to want to do something harmful? Address the emotion before the problematic behavior. Students need to be validated. People need to be validated. Before we get into like the bad thing that somebody did, why don't we talk about the thing that is stirring the person up, right? So we can do that, and we can do it in validating ways. As I said before, somebody's mad about whatever. Yeah, I understand that you're mad. I do. I get it. Right? And just hearing that, genuinely hearing that, is so crucial to somebody feeling just a little bit better for that moment. Right? So we need to attend to those things first. You can talk about and should talk about the problematic behaviors that happen afterwards, but it doesn't make any sense to do it while you're talking about the thing that they're actually concerned about. It actually makes things worse. It's harder to even, sort of process what's going on there. And it probably taps into the insecurities more. Step 7, strategies for stability, strategies for growth, strategies beyond school, strategies for life. So schools have this great opportunity, instead of punishing somebody, instead of putting somebody in ISS or OSS or expulsions or detentions, they have this great opportunity to actually teach in a long-term way, not just in a hit or miss kind of way, but in a long-term way about how do we actually deal with these things in our lives? How do we deal with stress? How do we recognize bad stresses? How do we recognize chronic stresses? How do we understand what's going on in our society to see how it's affecting us? What can we do about these things? How can I emotionally manage these things so that they don't turn out to be, bad experiences for me or even life-changing experiences in really negative ways? Schools have this amazing opportunity to teach about this stuff, just like a subject area, and do a much better job getting people to understand themselves better. We can do that, right? And we do it in bits and pieces sometimes, but it's really superficial kind of stuff. So we need to do a much better job of thinking about what it means to even provide that kind of a support service and a learning experience. And it should be K through 12. This is not something that should It can be on demand, like when somebody has something that happens, they can have a sort of on demand experience, and there are some of those, right? Maybe they talk to a school psychologist or a teacher or somebody, right? The administrator. But that's not enough, as we all know. We can do much better with that. Step 8, purpose, relationships, growth. If we're actually teaching towards happiness and thriving, of the core of our social emotional learning, if we're actually doing that, we're going to inevitably be teaching towards what it means to be a thriving society, because you can't ignore the externals. The externals affect us very deeply, and we are really not capable of creating long-term positive change when our internals are so deeply affected by the externals in such negative ways, right? And we're certainly not going to create change when we're all just sort of hopped up on greed and consumerism and wealth, and consumerism as a proxy for wealth when we can't have wealth. None of that is helping us make a better society when we're hyper focused on that as sort of ways to deal with our hurt and our pain. So, we're addicted to everything, and yet not really capable or able to do much about changing our own society. That's our own imprisonment right there. If you make people addicted and greedy, they're not going to do anything to change society because they're so focused on those things. So we can do better, right? A thriving society needs people who are well equipped to work with each other and connect their purposes with mindsets of responsibility, not greed. And if you look at that bottom picture again, there's a lot of responsibility in there to create that kind of a society. But we have to want to be that kind of responsible. We have to want to look at our society with a critical eye and not be afraid to say, hey, you know what? This isn't working, right? We really do need to do something different here. And the people who are really invested in keeping it that way, there's been a lot of discussion about that for hundreds of years, of what to do with them. And I'm not going to put anything out there right now, but I will say this. The way in which that changes is by ultimately changing the populace at large. So we need to get there. And I know that that's hard, but we're going to be a better society if we can get there. Deep growth happens in the context of purpose, not just for its own sake. And creating a more thriving society is worthy context. It's a worthy context for public school education. So we need to shift away from ideology of greed and making people employees, and move towards what does it mean to co-create a thriving democratic society where we can truly be a functional, caring community with each other. Not perfect, not without confrontation, not without problems, but we need to move and get to a new place. Right? So, the difference between hating and loving school. Students who deal with relentless chronic stress in large part because of an unjust society that exploits them and creates deficit identities makes kids dislike school intensely, while a schooling experience that values them and validates them often makes them like school intensely. Right? This is a whole other discussion for other point in time. Again, my students would have seen this, but basically what we're talking about here is here's a way in which we sort of think about what it means to plan teaching. One is what's going on in society and our justice issues. Let's think about that. Let's teach about that. Let's teach towards that. Let's teach about what it means to be a thriving society with those issues in mind. What does it mean to work with the emotions and the efficacy views that are in our classroom? Right? This is what I was talking about in just this presentation here. We have learning theories. What does it mean to learn? And I will say this, again, those of you that had me have heard this before, but those of you who may just simply be watching this video for the sake of watching the video, the learning theories that we have right now are heavily rooted in capitalism. They are framed by this ideology of greed. They are framed by creating people as employees. Behaviorism, cognitivism, they are all shaped by the larger external pressures of a society of exploitation and greed. So we need to spend some time re-examining our learning theories as well. But as teachers, we can consider that, look at the activities and the assessments that we're giving kids, what meaning and purpose and connections are they, what do they actually have? And then, really, after it's all said and done, have we taught towards happiness? Have we taught towards thriving? Have we taught towards sustainability? Have we taught towards caring for each other and caring for the planet, right? So I leave you here, right? Teaching towards betterment of society, social justice, sustainable progress, societal growth, societal higher self. So we have these sort of natural opportunities in our curriculum to teach towards this. If you really want to teach in a social emotional way, the curriculum has to follow. It can't just be these separate discussions about well-being and then dip back into a sort of greed-oriented curriculum. We need to have critical questioning and critical listening. We need to do this kind of integrative thinking, right? We need to have very solution-oriented and deliberation experiences. We need to deliberate, not debate. We need to deliberate. How are we going to make this better? What can we do? Let's work on this together, right? Authentic research into one's community. We are missing yet another opportunity, another discussion for another day, but certainly tied to this, which is that students can be the community researchers. They can do genuine, authentic work of looking at their own communities, and teachers can have them ask those kind of questions and do assignments with that in mind. And last, but I don't know that this is an exhaustive list, but these are certainly things that can get us down the road, is to have cumulative performance assessment. Forget the one-off standardized tests. We know that those are just not helpful. That kind of data is doing us in. What would it look like to shift to a cumulative performance assessment practices? It would be project-based. It would be community-based. It would be place-based, right? There would be a lot more in-depth look at what's going on with our kids. And each one of the skills that we teach right now would have a home in the projects, in the place-based, in the community-based. They would have purpose, and if they were authentically researching our societies, our communities, those skills would be truly applied rather than just something in the abstract. There you go. So, social emotional learning is not something that is just some sort of separate entity. It's very much interwoven with our society, with the overall schooling environment itself, with the history. It is something that we need to consider on all of these levels. And I'll leave you with that. Take care.